Peace and tranquility on the home front. Well, it isn't always peaceful. The new government and President Washington were setting the tone for handling domestic issues. Under the Articles of Confederation, the government had been weak and ineffective. That cannot be the case anymore. This time, when a rebellion breaks out, the government is able to put it down effectively. Handling the domestic issues dealing with Native American tribes was very complex and led to some of the U.S. first military conflicts. To highlight these issues in this lesson, we will cover the Whiskey Rebellion and the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Rebelling over whiskey. So, what caused people to rebel over whiskey? After the Revolutionary War, the federal government agreed to take on the war debt of the states. To help pay these debts, the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, put a 25% excise tax on all of the liquor sold in the United States. An excise tax is a tax on the sale or use of a product. This tax was strongly opposed by the farmers in the western areas of all states south of New York because they relied on producing whiskey to make a living. You see, transporting grain as liquor was much easier than transporting it as grain. By 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion was in full swing. Tax collectors sent to western Pennsylvania were routinely tarred and feathered, making it impossible to collect the whiskey tax there. That June, local officers ordered the leaders of the whiskey tax resistance arrested, but all this did was incite the farmers to more violence. A month later, the commander of the local militia was shot and killed by federal troops. The troops were defending a tax official. This really fired up the local anti-tax folks, who went on to burn down the buildings owned by the tax official. Washington reacted by calling up a militia from several states. He put on his old uniform from the Revolution and led the army of over 12,000 troops himself. This ended the rebellion swiftly, with no bloodshed. Rebels saw this overwhelming force commanded by General Washington himself, and they instantly dispersed. The government had the authority and the means now to deal with something like this. President Washington pardoned the rebels to make sure there were no ill feelings from the crisis toward the new government. The outcome of the Whiskey Rebellion showed the supremacy of the federal government, but it did make people wary of the government's power. The Battle of Fallen Timbers. This battle is not greatly talked about, but it certainly is important. It set the stage for settlement and the policies of the U.S. government in dealing with Native American tribes. You see, the British had signed deals with tribes, guaranteeing their rights to lands in the Northwest Territory. Well, the new American government was not in the business of following the deals made by the British. Since the federal government wasn't able to make money under the Articles of Confederation, it began selling off land in the Northwest Territory. The problem is, the tribes there had signed deals with the British guaranteeing the tribes' right to the land. This is what led to the issues. White settlers began moving into the territory which had been promised in writing by the British to Native Americans. Several tribes came together to form the Western Confederacy. It included villages from the Iroquois, Shawnee, Miami, and many others. The tribes chose to fight, believing the British would support them. They were wrong. Fighting breaks out. How does President Washington handle this? Well, his famous quote is, "In peace if I can, and to be prepared for war if I cannot." He could not. The entire conflict is referred to as the Northwest Indian War. The Tribal Confederation had several victories over American forces, and Washington did realize that much of the blame for violence belonged to the American settlers. Still, he had to act. In 1792, President Washington ordered General Mad Anthony Wayne, a hero from the Revolutionary War, to build a force to finish the issue. Wayne saw that earlier campaigns had failed because of lack of training and discipline. Current peace talks gave him time to train his volunteers. The war chief for the Shawnee was Blue Jacket. He and other tribal leaders held their ground, even as some, such as Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, tried to build a compromise. In 1793, Wayne's army of 4,600 men, the Legion of the United States, marched north from Fort Washington near modern Cincinnati, Ohio. Wayne was also aided by scouts from the Choctaw and Chickasaw tribes. Wayne used a tactic that made quick work of the battle. He sent out word of the attack plan, but then waited a couple of extra days. He knew it was the custom of the area tribes to fast before battle. With the extra delay, the native forces were tired and weak. The battle was over quickly. In retreat, the Native American forces fell back to Fort Miami, a British outpost. When they arrived, the gates were closed. The fort's commander was not willing to start a war with the U.S. Wayne stuck around with his army for several days, destroying native forces, villages, and crops. The battle led to the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. This ceded most of modern Ohio to the U.S. One young Shawnee veteran of the battle was Tecumseh. He did not sign the treaty, and years later, he renewed native resistance. So a recap of the Whiskey Rebellion and the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The early days of the United States would set the precedent for how things are handled in the states. These early events showed the new government was willing to take action and look out for the new country's interests. In the Whiskey Rebellion, President Washington showed that the government would take action and back up its mandates. In the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the U.S. showed they had the military strength to assert authority over its borders, although they were in dispute. Opinions were everywhere in the new nation. People appreciated the help the French had given the U.S. in the Revolution, and people were anti-monarchy. Many people wanted the U.S. to take a role on the world stage. President Washington knew better. Washington understood that the new nation was too weak to go off fighting the world, even to help the French. He knew that Britain was still taking steps to undermine the new republic. To better understand the early foreign affairs of the U.S., we will look at involvement in the French Revolution, the Jay Treaty, and the Treaty of San Lorenzo. So the French Revolution. We have to understand that the French people were inspired by the American Revolution. Perhaps the French were only involved in the American Revolution to undermine their British enemies, but they were there just the same. This made for many Americans being very sympathetic toward the cause of the French Revolution. Helping our allies and doing anything that would strike back at the British was very appealing to many. On top of it, the British were still trying to find back doors into causing trouble for the states. Washington knew the U.S. did not have the strength to get involved at this point as a young nation. It would stretch our resources too thin and antagonize our enemies. President Washington had also been advised that the French cause did not have the kind of cause to show the restraint and have the outcome of the American Revolution. This proved true through the execution of Louis XVI and the whole Reign of Terror. So what do they do with the minister France is sending? Should they recognize him as a representative of a legitimate government? The minister they sent was Edmond Genet. The guy got off the boat from France, and instead of going to report to the official channels, he went on a PR tour of the South. He was drumming up support for his cause. This behavior made the decision easy for President Washington. He had him recalled back to Europe. Genet actually stayed, although not there officially anymore. He probably would be guillotined in France. As a side note, Jefferson handed in his resignation to President Washington over the whole Genet affair. He was pro-supporting the French, but he couldn't continue to back Genet with how out of control his behavior got. The time was so tense, Washington needed his Secretary of State, so he was able to convince him to stay on a while longer. So the official position of the U.S. on the French Revolution was neutrality, even though there was a great deal of popular support. So did we win points with the British? How were the relations going there? Well, the British weren't exactly happy with losing. Even after the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the war, the British wouldn't leave their forts in the Northwest Territory. They kept on seizing American ships, and they would impress the sailors. Impressment is when sailors are forced into naval service. You can imagine this did not make the Americans happy. To be fair, the U.S. also kept passing navigation laws that were damaging to the British. So obviously, these parties needed some communication. In 1794, the U.S. sent John Jay to Britain as a special envoy to negotiate the two nations' differences. In November 1794, Jay's treaty was signed, and it probably averted war with Britain. The treaty got the British out of the Northwest Territory within 2 years, established America's claim for damages from British ship seizures, and provided America a right to trade in the West Indies. So everyone in the States celebrated, right? No. President Washington did push for support, and it passed the Senate in 1795. That being said, John Jay was actually burned in effigy by mobs in America. So why were they not happy? People believed the treaty was unfair. It did not deal with the issue of impressment of American sailors, and didn't handle the British interference in American trade to people's satisfaction. Basically, the mobs thought Jay brought home a one-sided treaty. The Treaty of San Lorenzo was negotiated by Thomas Pinckney, America's special envoy to Spain. The agreement allowed American settlers the right to deposit their exports in New Orleans and to engage in commerce in the city. This was really important to the more than 100,000 Westerners who lived in Kentucky and Tennessee, and to the thousands of settlers who lived in the area that is now Ohio. In the treaty, Spain recognized the southern and western boundaries of the U.S. The treaty allowed the U.S. access to the area now known as the states of Mississippi and Alabama. Opening up the Mississippi to American navigation was huge. The treaty also helped with the expansion of American borders. The Treaty of San Lorenzo, or Pinckney's Treaty, was signed in October of 1795. So let's summarize. Foreign affairs were complex and very important in America's early years as a new nation. Many in America wanted to support the French Revolution, but the U.S. stayed neutral. President Washington was convinced the young nation couldn't be spread that thin by getting drawn into others' wars. Jay's treaty averted war with Britain, but the American people were not pleased and felt the treaty was unfair. The Treaty of San Lorenzo, or Pinckney's Treaty, established the U.S. southern and western borders and opened up the Mississippi to American navigation.